there were key words that were jumping out at me when I was listening to researchers present on our community, on our Indigenous IPHA community. And there were words that were always being used. And those were deficit words. You know, I didn't articulate it at the time, but they were words that really unpacked the trauma in our lives, and continually unpack that. And those words were like jumping out at me when I was listening to researchers present on us. And I thought, hey, why do they keep talking about all of this again and again? Is that the only thing that can be talked about? Hearing all those presentations and reflecting on it and thinking about it, I thought, well, I'm going to talk to my peers. I'm going to talk to other Indigenous women and find out, like, you know, how they felt about this, the way we were being presented. And because at the time, I felt like I was doing my own exploratory kind of, you know, research in my own little way as a community person. And so I began to speak to other women, and they too had the same thought, that too much time was spent on only presenting on our trauma and highlighting the deficits. There was very little that talked about our strengths. There was one word though that was consistently used, and that was the word resilient. So I'll just give you an example of a presentation, perhaps a scenario of going to a research conference and hearing somebody present on us, Indigenous people living with HIV, and unpacking all the trauma, and highlighting that they collected this information through focus groups, and then presenting on it, and highlighting all of that. And then at the end, their big conclusion always was, but they're resilient. That was quite often the conclusion to a research project that was unpacking the pathogenic story about Indigenous people. And and during the presentation as well, sometimes as trauma was being unpacked, you know, everybody was listening to it. And you'd hear little, you know, you'd see people in the audience, because I'm very observant as well. So I'd see how people were taking it in, and I would see people going, "Aw," or even crying, you know, and shedding a little tear. And then, but when the conclusion came, but they're resilient, but they're resilient, everybody would clap. And I thought, well, that kind of sucks. You know, we're more than we're more than the story that was just told about us. We're more than that. So I did a 13-city cross-country process. I called it a consultation at the time, just to hold conversations with Indigenous women living with HIV in those 13 cities. And it also included speaking to the service providers, healthcare providers, and all the people that loved and supported us as a community of women. And this is what I was hearing from other women as well. You know, enough of unpacking these kinds of stories about us. So before I talk about Indigenous storytelling as a research method, I want to underscore what some of the scholars have said in terms of story. And maybe I'm mistakenly calling Thomas King, the author. He's a prolific Indigenous author. That has a huge body of work, and I've read most of his books. And he did a lecture called the Massey Lectures as part of the Massey All Lecture Series, and where he talked about story. And one of the things that I've often used of his quote is a story where he says, where he warns us that once a story is told, it is loose in the world. So you have to be careful with the stories you tell. And you have to watch out for the stories that you are told. And then there's an Indigenous scholar, Sean Wilson, who authored Research as Ceremony. He also expressed that some stories, because of their sacredness, should not be revealed, because this strips them of their spiritual and sacred elements. To write them down is to transform them, to endanger them, and ultimately may serve to deactivate them. In my case, the questions I was asking were strengths-based questions. So I try not to, as a researcher myself, I try to frame all questions to get that story, to kind of reframe a story in a way, like help them to reframe that story so that it comes from a strengths-based place. And so as an example, the questions that we asked, envisioning health 1, envisioning health 2, they were the same questions. What does health look like for you? What does health look like for you as an HIV positive Indigenous woman? And the second question, how does culture support your health as an HIV positive Indigenous woman? I didn't ask about their trauma. And we brought in culture in terms of how culture supported their health. And I think when you ask those kinds of questions, the story is going to be different. The story that you're going to elicit from the circle, the people in the circle, are going to be very different. It's a different entry point than if I were to ask them about their trauma, about how they manage their lives living with HIV, with multitude of challenges. As soon as you start using some of those words, you kind of set the stage for them to talk about their challenges. So I avoid those kinds of words. I just want to hear about your health. What does your health look like for you? And you know, so that really helps in terms of framing that story that comes out of that story circle. It's a different entry point. It's not, and it's also honoring them, because in that circle, we're all sacred beings. We are all sacred beings. And that's why they use that word, atsukan, those stories that come from spirit.